We now welcome back to the stage James Hitchmough to share with us his decades of experience in using sowing to create ecological plantings on a large scale for use in public landscapes.
I'm just going to wait a second because everyone's heading for the hills or heading for the loo. Good, okay. Well, hello again. Since it's the last day of summer, I'm wearing my shorts as a sort of celebration, I guess. Okay, so I want to talk about my work on sowing. And so what my work's all been about, it's about rethinking the use of vegetation in cities in response to the following policy drivers. First of all, we live in a world of declining funding, and this is particularly so in green space. I mean, if you live in London, or if you live in affluent parts of London, not much has changed. But if you live in cities like Sheffield, it's literally the gardening, landscape management infrastructure has literally been scraped away. It's an extraordinary situation, and this is happening across the UK. So it's really desperate situation. There's a need to reduce carbon and water expenditures because we just all have to do that. I'll just whiz through this really quickly. And there's a need to deliver function as well as aesthetics through planting. So, if you want to get money these days for doing planting in urban landscapes in Britain, the best chance is to link it to something like stormwater management. And then you'll probably be successful. But if you just ask for cash, otherwise it won't happen. So biodiversity and stormwater management really important. We have to talk about climate change. We've talked about climate change a little bit, but I don't think we necessarily fully appreciate just how significant the changes are what we're going to face. The best current model for London in 2080 is Bordeaux. So it's about a 7-degree latitudinal shift. So New York will become south of Washington. Madrid becomes North Africa. It's all change. So we have to allow for that. So we need to look to the future. We can't look to the past because the past will not have the answers that we want to have in it. There's a need to enrich the lives of human beings. That's really important. I mean, that's absolutely critical in my work. And the way I've tried to do this has been by what I've called design plant communities. And you've heard a lot about those already type thing. And sometimes those communities are native, and sometimes they're not. So it's very context specific. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, because that's been quite a big issue in my work. Because when you work with meadows, the very term of meadows is a very politically contested idea. And over the years, I've had numerous fights at conferences with people who said, meadows are ours, i.e. their local vegetation. But of course, for me, meadows in many ways are just a form of spatial organization. So you can think of meadows as a sort of political icon of a part of the world, or you can simply think of them of a very finely grained form of spatial arrangement in design planting. So take your pick. And my context for doing all this has been essentially the multicultural climate change city. Now, I'm talking about meadows today, but a few of you have talked about trees, but I did just want to make a point very quickly that I also work with trees, and so you will see very few trees in these images I'm going to show you in the presentation. But this is just some work we're doing in central Beijing at the moment, creating the first multi-canopy native woodland right in the center of Beijing. Looks like that. So a lot of the principles, the ecological principle of understanding how you design with herbaceous plant communities are directly applicable to woody plants too. The systems are essentially the same. It's all about light extinction, just as meadows are. Now, I've been very interested philosophically in the context in which my meadow work takes place. And of course, and so, as I've said a minute ago, because meadows are such a politically contested idea, all about, is it native, is it not native, et cetera, et cetera. I've been very interested in these different authors' ideas about meadows. But I guess for me, I really like this book. You know, this is Ian Thompson, and Ian Thompson, before he became a landscape architect, he was a philosopher. And I think the work I do, it's certainly about ecology, and I think it's about community too. It's about what people think of these things, and in particular, I think it's about delight. So I'm really interested, wherever I can, in creating experiences for people, even if they're temporal, which are really meaningful. And so I'd like to see myself at least having some role to play in what you might call the manufacture of joy. And that sounds a little bit sort of bit bling, but I do think it's an important goal, and meadows can really play an important role in that sort of experience. So the meadows I create, they're on a whole range of different scales, and I guess you in the audience, some of you work in the big public scale, some of you will work in gardens. So my work with meadows, some of the work I do is at the very small scale. So this is help me, Cambridge Botanic Gardens people. I guess this is about 500 square meters, perhaps 250 square meters in the Cambridge Botanic Garden, and this is done through sowing seed. With a little bit of planting. So it's all mainly seed sowing. And then you go up a notch to the next scale. Oh, just a second. Somewhere between the Guardian. Oh yeah, here we go. I have my gardens illustrated with me, just to show that I'm a true believer and I'm okay. And in this month's Gardens Illustrated, you've got this project, you've got Woodston House. It's on the cover, it's inside, here we go. Oh, can't find it, never mind. Here we go. So this is Woodston House. There we go. Okay. So it's an intermediate sized project. It's about 2,000 square meters. And then we keep on going up. And then you get to the big scale. So this is the London Olympic Park, and there, what you're looking at there are some of the native wildflower meadows I made as part of that project. And there were 10 hectares of those, and they form the skin pretty much of the North Park. So these sort of ideas can be applied at a whole range of scales. They're not sort of fixed. And of course, in doing this work, as you'll gather from yesterday, part of my life is to work as a plant ecologist. And so what we've done as part of this work, we've also looked at very novel ways to control the development of the plant communities we've been making. So this is the BMX track at the London Olympic Park, and if you're wondering what the soil is crushed concrete. So that is the soil. And the reason for that is by using very low nutrient substrates in the absence of any maintenance, because there is no maintenance there, that site will never be maintained. Because it's run by a local authority who hasn't got any cash. It will allow you to control the vegetation development, so it will always be fairly sparse and low, and by that technique you will be able to control the future to a very significant degree. So we've had to use those techniques because it's simply not possible in many urban sites to do some of the things which we've been talking about in the last couple of days. So you've got to find other ways which are sometimes quite challenging to use, and everyone will think you're crazy. And I'm going to show you a very high-spec project later on, which is actually manufactured on the previous building that occupied the site. So, these things can be applied to very glamorous sites as well as to a site where people are only interested in mountain biking on. So what sort of species and plant communities do I work with, and how have I done all of this? What we typically do is we adopt what I would call a gradient approach. So when we're deciding what we're going to make, we look at local character, we look at the resources available for management, and we look at the anticipated political and cultural response to what we might make. And that gets us thinking about an approach. When we're dealing with rural areas or urban areas with these values, we nearly always work entirely with native species. When we look at intensely urban areas, we use whatever we feel is best. We have no particular preference for natives. So we will use what we feel is appropriate. And you know, if you're in the East End of London dealing with a first-generation Bangladeshi, they have absolutely no interest in whether the vegetation is native or non-native. It's a completely alien concept for them. So again, it depends entirely on who you're dealing with. So that's the sort of spectrum. And I think most British people intuitively recognize these sorts of gradients. So generally the decisions we make seem to make sense to most people too. So I don't have any fixed approaches to this, and I think Cassian was talking yesterday about in Germany how you have often very rigorous sort of schema for what you can use and what sort of vegetation. I'm really very uncomfortable with those ideas because they often lead to the most stupid decisions. So I would rather keep it loose. I mean, what is the point of training people to be intelligent professionals if you then have to make them jump through very foolish hoops? It seems rather absurd to me. And we nearly always work with species that are stress tolerators. We never work with invasive species. Invasive species are of no use to me because they would simply eliminate the diversity I'm trying to achieve. So I really want plant species which hold space but do not colonize space. So I want to work with things which essentially form a dinner plate or a saucer type shape and not really go beyond that. And then I can do all sorts of things with them. Obviously, it's a really hot potato at the moment, and it's more of a hot potato in some parts of the world than the other. Britain is about intermediate in this. But I mean, there's a big issue about, you should be using native species because they're better for wildlife. Now, I have to tell you, from the perspective of Western Europe, as an ecologist, that the literature certainly doesn't suggest that at all. In fact, we used to believe that all invertebrates, for example, needed to have native species for them to complete their life cycles and do this sort of thing. Now, that's certainly true of many of the butterfly Lepidoptera, but that's an exception to the rule. So what we now know, and there's just a little paper from Journal of Applied Ecology, that in actual fact, particularly for pollinators, goodness to pollinators is not related to nativeness. It's related to the provision of goods and services, such as the concentration of sugar in nectar, or pollen quality, or flower shape. But you get very poor correlation with nativeness. And in actual fact, and you're probably not aware of this, there's a huge mass of literature now on this. But it's in places you can never access because you don't have subscriptions to Journals of Applied Ecology. But you have access to Jennifer Owen's book on the wildlife of a garden, which is the longest study on the planet of invert and plant relationships. So I suggest you get a copy of that. And there's a whole range of other access to this. So, so we do our work in the context of these political debates, but I'm reasonably relaxed, certainly in Western Europe, because of what we now know about invert and plant relationships. Now, of course, hopefully some of you have bought this book, and I'll be very grateful next time the invoice comes from the publishers. So a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today are actually in this book. So in a way, I'm giving you like a sort of an anime. You could read the book and just go home. Though, I'd be the odd gag every now and again, obviously, type thing. But my journey started a long time ago in this. I'm a child, in terms of university education, I'm a child of the 1970s. And in the mid-1970s, an ecologist at the Institute for Terrestrial Ecology near Cambridge, a guy called Terry Wells, he was given a research contract to explore how to remake native wildflower meadows on sites from which they'd been destroyed. So I knew Terry and I was aware of this sort of work. And then after I finished my PhD, I cleared off and got a job in Australia. So I stood on that roadside to the west of Melbourne in 1985. And what that is, that's the rarest plant community in Australia. Forget the rainforest and all that sort of stuff. That's the rarest plant community. That's a community called Western Plains grassland, and it's surviving there on that Mohican because that's where they took the subsoil from beneath the road when they widened the road, and they put it on the side of the road, and the few surviving native species that hadn't been eliminated by sheep grazing and competition then invaded onto this very poor soil. The concrete, you begin to get the idea? And they've persisted on that for the last 50 years, where they've been eliminated everywhere else. So I looked at that and I thought, well, it's a little bit short on gas, aesthetic gas. But I could do something with that. So I began to look at how I could transfer this plants from this plant community and perhaps create an urban vegetation that might be really useful in the city of Melbourne. And so we start off doing this sort of stuff, and what you're looking at there, you're looking at the effect of competition on a forb from this system. And you can see in the coarse leaf grass, all of the seedlings have been eliminated. In the fine leaf grass, all of the grey leaf seedlings have persisted. You need to understand about these competitive relationships. So we start to do that, and I kicked on with that and kicked that sort of work off in Australia. And then I came back to the UK in the early 1990s, and I stood there in that's at the Morton Arboretum in the USA. Now that's a prairie. That's what a tall grass prairie looks like. That's Echinacea pallida. 4th of July, I just got off the aeroplane, and that was a real Damascene moment for me. I just thought, wow, now that's actually a manufactured prairie. That's a prairie that was made in the 1940s. So it's an artificial prairie, but it's a very nice prairie and is now a really sort of very species rich. So I looked at that and I thought, okay, got to try making some of that. And so I began to think about the work not as a restoration ecologist, but very much more as someone who is working to create beauty, joy, special moments, as well as all the other goods and services such as pollination benefits, etc., etc. So I was interested in that. But what I was interested in diversity. I wanted to create vegetation which was diverse, and I really liked the idea of trying to do that perhaps through sowing, because then you could do big areas. It probably would be very cheap per unit time, and you could use this sowing as a sort of liquid which you poured through urban spaces to join things together, as opposed to that very fiddly thing of having to plant things. Planting's a very retrograde technology, isn't it, really, if you think about it, So I love that picture. That's in Baton Rouge, and that's what I call American mulch world. Where we love mulch. God, I see the sun rising on the mulch. And it really does something to my soul, type thing. So, and if you look at the spatial form of mulch world, what it consists of a species repeated over and over again to fill the space. But if you were to rethink spatially how those individuals worked, you could create something which is really rather interesting. So just imagine, for example, if some of the things in red are another species and they flower in spring and say they have red flowers, and if the rather mustardy yellow things flower in spring, and then if you had other species within the space which flowered at other times, say in early summer, and then in late summer or autumn, what you've now done, you've gone from having a system which is very simple, in which you can only have a set of aesthetic events once probably in that whole square, and now you've created something which has a mass of changing events in space and time in each square meter. So that really seemed a very seductive idea. And of course, that is essentially what happens in meadows. And just to show you how it works in the real world, here's now I know this looks slightly bizarre. This looks a little bit like, sort of like Polyantha's annual bedding, on LSD. It's a sort of, but what this actually, or it could be a cemetery for hippopotami. One of the two. But these are actually, ecologists love squares and rectangles. We love them. You know, we like to set about experiments in these rectilinear grids. And this is actually experimental work looking at how you could use primula species. There's 20 different primula species in these patches. And these have been sown. And this is the March flowering, the March to April flowering one. And what you've got is you've got those coloured balls, which are the different species in each piece of space. So in spring, it looks like this. So that's about April. And then in early May, this is the same place each time. Okay, same square meter of space. And then a month later, it looks like that. So what's happening is the different species with their different phonologies, i.e. their different times to do things, are emerging from the lower layer, which is already flowered, and then pushing up into the next layer. Now this is the phonology or the poetry of natural plant communities. This is what they do. And so the job for me was to actually explore and exploit this as a way to producing long-flowering plant communities in which you got this constant change on a weekly basis through time. You go another month, and it looks like that. Yeah? So you're getting the feeling. Now, this seemed really quite exciting because I knew Terry Wells really well, and I know lots of ecologists really well, and they don't see this they're not interested in these sorts of devices. They're just interested in it's a meadow with 20 species in it. Okay? For them, it's a head count, how many species. In ecology, the greatest measure of goodness is how many species per square meter. What it looks like is of no interest. So it was a way to sort of exploit these sorts of ideas. So when I design meadows, what we do is, we use spreadsheets quite a bit because they're quite a useful device to help thinking, is we plot out when the species actually flower so that we can determine exactly where we have peaks and troughs. And if we want to have flowering at a certain time, for example, if we want to have a big hit in July, then we perhaps need to increase the density of the species which flower in July to achieve that or reduce or whatever else. So that's a crazy succulent meadow we made in San Sebastian, which is one of the world's oddest vegetations. The good citizens of San Sebastian were a bit disturbed by it, I think, but I rather liked it. The other thing we do when we design meadows is we design them in layers. So we think about layers. So if you just want to deconstruct a lot of vegetation, it often consists of layers, even though when you look at it, you just think, oh, there's just one layer there. That's very rarely the case. So this is some sketches for the planted meadowy vegetation we made at Olympic Park. This is for the South African garden. You've got a base layer, which is a grassy tussock layer. And then you have massless geophytes, which push out, which cast very little shade. And then you have another layer which pushes out, getting bigger and bigger. And then you have another layer pushing out to create that. So we design these meadows layer by layer in the spreadsheet. And it just allows you to conceptualize things in ways which are far more sophisticated than is normally the rule. And you can really pack in lots of different species by using these layers. And that makes something. I showed you this picture yesterday, but I'll show it to you again, simply as a counterpoint, not for its own sake. So you saw that picture yesterday. Now, that's the upper layer you were seeing. But if you look at that vegetation in spring, it's got another layer beneath it called Pulsatilla vulgaris, which is just shade tolerant enough to persist under the prairie layer which goes on the top. So this layering allows you to create seasonal events. It allows you to maintain species in there when plants are very densely packed, which you couldn't do if they all sat in one layer. There wouldn't be enough lateral space for them to occupy. Okay. So that's some of the ideas. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the research process we use to pilot these sorts of things. And then I'm going to show you some little case studies of where we've used this in practice. Can you all hang in for a cup of coffee for a little while? I'm killing for a coffee, but that's just how it is, isn't it? Hey, it's the last day of me being head of department today. Hallelujah! It all finishes at 5 o'clock. Mercy. 5 years of torture. So the process of developing these vegetation types. So one of the first things is, obviously, if you work with native wildflower meadows, you don't need to do any conception. What you do is you go and get a list, either from the vegetation of the British Isles, or you go to Emmersgate Seed and you get a list. You buy a bag, you spread it on the ground at 1 gram per square meter, you do a lot of praying, and then you crash and burn. Normally, that's what you do. There's no design, there's no conceptualization. You just buy the bag. That didn't seem very good to me. If you want to create things to meet needs of people, to create emotional responses, you need to have a bit more control of this process than buying the bag. So the way most of my conceptualizing has been done standing in the shower. I'm really good thinking in the shower. And so I think about things which are, what will be useful in an urban world of climate change and no money and packs of dogs eating old people and the world we're doubtless heading for, the world of austerity. I've thought a lot about that. And so once you've done that initial thinking, what I've then done is I've identified some semi-natural stereotypes from the world's most interesting vegetation, and then I've trolleyed off there to have a look at them. Because, it's very difficult in the cultural realm to keep imagining new vegetation which is different. Because there's only so many ways you can arrange the deck chairs, isn't there? I think one only needs to go to Chelsea very occasionally. The same could be said of many National Trust gardens. Yeah, you're not clapping now, are you, the ones from the National Trust? But I know, because I spent my life traveling the world looking at I know there are things out there which are so extraordinary. They are really exciting stimuli for creativity, what you might actually make. So I've done that, and the plant communities I've worked on and know how to make, all of those. So we've worked on all of it. It takes 10 years to understand, but you run them in parallel, so you don't just do 3 in your life. Okay, so we now know, and we've published and all that. I've made a lot of those in public projects. I know how to do it. But what I really get off on is doing this. And those of you who understand Buddhist script will know that's on the borders of Tibet. And so there I am with Jingyu, looking at some Ajuga lupulina on a crushed brick slope. It's not brick, but it's like a crushed brick slope in Tibet. And what we're doing is, we're working out what information can we pull from that plant in its context. Now, some people talked yesterday about this thing about tolerance versus need. You remember? I thought I have to say, I thought the questions were answered very badly. But there you go. But let me give you a little model. So any plant, for every factor it has to interact with in its habitat, has a range, and we call that the niche breadth. So here's a plant, I've just made it up. PWP means it's very, very dry. Field capacity, permanent wilting points when it's very dry. Field capacity when soil is as wet as it can be. And for this particular species, what I'm saying is its optimal performance and its maximal competitiveness is where the dark purpley bit is. But it stretches that way, and it stretches that way. Okay, you get the idea? And all plants have that range. So Magnolia stellata, I told you about yesterday, it can also occupy that range, but there are certain points when it's more competitive. Very often the horticultural optimum, what we think of, is way out of the range. Yeah? Now, you may not appreciate that, but I can assure you that's true. That's why the well-drained loam. Well-drained loam works for most things, but it doesn't mean it's an optimal. It's just an easy point. Okay. Then you add competition. Because that previous model is for in the absence of competition. What competition does, it squashes the niche. So plants that previously would grow perfectly well in your garden, shall we say, in a soil which is, moist, might need now suddenly dry soil. Okay? So you get this niche compression, and it happens in competition. And of course, that's really important in my work, because meadows are intensely competitive systems. Traditional gardens have virtually no competition at all from an ecologist's perspective. The density of plants is just too low. So there is virtually no competition. They're almost competition-free. So that's why you can grow stuff almost independent of its habitat needs, because there's no competition. As soon as you expose plants to serious competition, as in the natural world, they just can't do it anymore. They have to retreat back to their niche. So just something to be interested about. It's a challenging set of ideas. Anyway, enough of that. That's me being professor. Let's go back and look at some nice pics. So, an afternoon on the Balang Shan in western Sichuan is something to die for. Indeed, if you're not careful with those yaks, it is something to die for. Because yaks are extraordinarily territorial when you get down to photograph them, because they must think you're some sort of mating ritual. So, you look down, you get up, and there's some yak going, and you're going, no, it's okay, you can have the ladies, I'm off. And of course, I've worked a lot in China, helping the Chinese to develop their own native plant resources for use in meadows. So, yeah, I like the flags. The flags are great, And there we are in China, finding remnants of low-altitude native vegetation that haven't been destroyed. And these are so rare in China. You can drive for hundreds of kilometers, 15, yeah, and never see. Are you sure you're being straight there? Anyway, so we're doing that. You get the idea. I've got to whiz a bit now. Okay, so here we are in the ancient hay meadows, the Carpathians, northeast Turkey. Look at that vegetation. Northeast China, South Africa. I've worked a lot in South Africa. Ridge of the Swartberg. That's me on the left, not the guy with the big beard. Okay, I just made that very clear. You probably think that Niphophis are dry plants because the RHS dictionaries tell you it is so. That's a bog, a wetland. Many Niphophis are wetland plants. It's full of big black cobras, and it's this deep in water. The literature is dodgy. It's written by people who haven't seen these plants in the wild, mostly. And you saw that yesterday. Shit, that's a place to die for. Fantastic. And what I then do is I take all of these plants and I resort them. So this vegetation is from all over the world, but they're all dry species. And you put them together in a community of stress tolerators, which is stable, or more or less stable. Okay. We do that sort of stuff. I'm whizzing along now. We evaluate robustness and hardiness and do that sort of stuff. So here we are killing South African geophytes. Colosseum, die. We're frost testing them. And at the end of a lot of death, we end up with things which people tell you couldn't grow. So that's Bulbinella from the winter rainfall parts of South Africa, which survived -9 in Sheffield. So we've done a lot of interesting stuff, imagining the unimagined. That's what it's about. And then we do a lot of science, because that's what we are. And here we are testing seed. Well, the question we're asking here is, if you sow 100 seed of a species, how many seedlings will you get in the field? Because if you know that, then you can begin to get control of this random process, and it can become a design technique rather than having a little prayer to God, which is what sowing normally is, type thing. We do the same in China. There's a little field station in China. And the question is, why? Why are we doing this? Okay. So I had this revelation in the shower one day, that it was very simple, really, to turn sowing into a design tool. You only needed 3 pieces of information. The first thing you need, let's see if I can get a little flashy thing here. Here we go. No! Didn't work. Anyway, never mind. Okay, so the first thing, I'm going to use that instead. You can't see it. Oh, yes, you can. No, you can't. Okay, I'm going to run across here. Okay. The first thing you need to know is, you need to know how many seedlings do you want to have in your meadow to do the business. Okay? And if something flowers for a very long time, you might want to have a lot more of it. If it flowers for a very short period, you might want to have less of it. There's a whole set of design decisions. How many of those things do you want to have? Just as with planting. Yes? Same process. The second thing you need to know is, you need to know how many seeds are there in a gram of seed. Yeah, that's information is available. It's all in Sowing Beauty. And then the next thing you just need to know, if you sow 100 seeds, how many typically turn into seedlings. We call that field emergence. And for any species, for a given quality of seed, it's pretty standard for that species. And we know that for 1,000 species now. We worked it all out. And then all you need is that terrifying looking sort of formula in red at the bottom. You paste that into the spreadsheet, you pull it down, and it tells you how many grams of seed you add per square meter or per 100,000 square meters to give you those numbers of seedlings per square meter. Do you get it? Elegant, isn't it? So that's what we did. And that then allows us to create plant communities of very precisely controlled composition and density, so that we can engineer, just like design. We write scientific papers. Well, we'll go past that very quickly. And then what we do is we have to investigate the long-term community development, recruitment, and management of these systems. So here we do. We've created this is South African vegetation. We've created this through sowing, through the techniques I've described. This is in the first year. And what we're doing is we're looking at how it changes over long periods of time, so that we have a sense of what the future will be like. So this is year 1. This is year 2 at the same time. Stuff changes. Stuff changes very quickly. And this is year 5. So the Niphophia has eliminated everything else almost. Now you will do that in your projects. We all do those sort of things in our projects. But this is to try to understand so we don't have to do it in our projects. So you have to drop the diversity of the Niphophia. And then we do these things in other parts of the world. This is in Western China. And then a year later, we write another scientific paper. Oh, God. If only they had color in them like that, really, they'd be much more exciting. And then we try to apply it to practice. So we've tried to road test to practice, and we've been doing this over the last 15, 20 years. Hopefully make some money. Me, really, I'm at one with my Chinese colleagues here. You can all sing. So we're about to sow the first meadow of this type in China. And I'm going to show you a little video now, and Amy's just going to give me a couple of more minutes, because she's that sort of girl.
In 2008, the University of Oxford Botanic Garden embarked upon a major...
This is the process in practice.
This area was first planted in the 1940s, and all the trees and shrubs had become over-mature together. So the entire site was cleared, the site was levelled, and then the area that was going to be the new border was covered in 3 inches of sand that was raked and rolled to be totally level. Professor James Hitchmough of Sheffield University had devised a plan with plants from 3 different geographical regions, from the Mediterranean, South Africa and North America. Tom Price, the garden's curator, mixed the seeds to a very precise recipe.
Oh, go on.
James then came down to Oxford, the seed was mixed with sawdust and then spread over the entire site, ensuring that the seeds were randomly spread through the mixture. Once the seed had been sown, it could be raked carefully into
Bit
the
of planting too, just
before the whole
Gigantea,
area
Ferula
was
communis.
covered in jute netting, a very loose weave, so that the plants could grow up through the holes in the matting. This matting is there to hold the sand and the seeds in place. In the spring of 2011, it was very bare. In the summer of 2012, it looked a bit weedy, but by 2013, we had created a new wow feature at the Botanic Garden. And here is James talking to a group of visitors about the border.
With these sort of borders, potentially, there is no X. That's enough of that. Okay. Okay, so, hey, and then it was in Gardens Illustrated, so it must have been really good, mustn't it? So I'm going to go this. I'm just going to whiz through this incredibly quickly. Okay, I just want to show you some of the images. Is that okay? Hey, it's my last day. Remember? Okay, so I'll show you this. I'll show you the Eurasian element. There were 3 communities in this in the Botanic Gardens in Oxford. This is the Eurasian one. That's in May, June, July, August, September. North American looks like that. Early successional species, later successional species. In August, oh gosh, that's October. Looks a bit crap. It's perfectly okay to produce vegetation that looks crap. You all do it. Tom Stuart Smith's prairie. This is his garden prairie. This is about 2,000 square meters. This is in May, using some European species to provide early color. Tom likes to stick autumn coloring, suckering, resprouting shrubs in there for autumn effect. That's Loveys from London. Sort of. What are they doing? They're sort of cooing, aren't they? Cooing in it, probably getting ready for Gardens Illustrated to photograph it. That's on the same day. Mine is the Loveys, Sans Loveys. And then this is Woodston House, which you've seen. And then we have the Olympic Park. Olympic Park's big, as you know. Native wildflower meadows, other meadows. Here we are on the first day sowing. Can't remember the guy's name, but he was really good. I trained him in a porter cabin. We had 10 hectares to do. Had to be very busy. This is native stuff. This is what it looked like for 2012. Pretty wow, sort of. And the whole landscape made of this, and this is what it looks like today. And then I'm just going to show you the project at Fidelity International. This is one of the best projects I've done. This is with Tom Stuart Smith, native meadows and prairie, set in the countryside in Tonbridge. And I'm going to show you mostly stuff of the cerise pink stuff, which is the prairie. Now this is really interesting. Here is the prairie 6 months after sowing. We have to irrigate during the germination window from March to May. If we fail doing this, it's because you simply didn't irrigate enough. It's as simple as that. If the irrigation's good, it works. If the irrigation's too sparse, it crashes. It's as simple as that. The soil is crushed building with subsoil clay. I wanted to use an incredibly infertile material because I wanted to use them as an experiment to see what would happen. And it was a bit terrifying because it's a financial institution and they would have me hung on a gallows, probably, type thing. Anyway, it was all good. A few bumpy parts on the way. In July 2016, it looked like that. Before it flowers, it looks like that, and then it flowers, and it's all very nice. In spring, it looks like that, and the same plot a month later looks like this. I think this is, self-referential, I know, but I think that's very, very beautiful vegetation, very structured. You see how it's hard? It almost looks as if it's planted. That's because of the low productivity levels. When you've got really fertile soils, you just get mush. But Britain is a culture that loves mush in terms of garden planting. We love mush. I like harder lines. The same place looks like that in a big thousands of square meters of this stuff. I know we all want a coffee. I've only got 2 slides to go. In winter, that same area looks like that. They're just about to cut it off. They should cut it off very late March, early April, but often they're under pressure from the merchant bankers to cut it off earlier. If you do that, you get much more weed invasion, so we try to keep it as long as possible. And because of the very low nutrient subsoil, this is on top of a car park, as a subterranean car park. And you see the weedy thing at ground levels. That's a sweet clover legume, and that was a big problem in the really open bits. And it's inevitable in these crushed concrete soils because of the high phosphorus and potassium. And what we did is we just pushed the burning regime, because we flash burn this every spring in April. We just pushed it back, and that's the same area the next year, and we've completely eliminated. It's just a tiny little change in the management. Just got rid of the problem completely. They are very creative. I talked about Joe yesterday, and this is after cutting down in spring, and they've actually applied a contact herbicide over that edge square meter to see what effect that would have on the species, and they've just been really great, and they've been really so creative. And just to finish on, this is a picture into the vegetation in spring, and with the exception of the ribwort plantains, which are no problem, it's absolutely clean after 10 years. It's pristine without hand weeding. It's just by using these simple sort of processes. So it's a bit of in many ways, it's a fantastic project. Okay, so in conclusion, these techniques are not a magic bullet. They can go badly wrong, and indeed they have gone badly wrong, but they can be applied to most plant communities. They're very cheap. You're talking about the cost. The thing you've seen at Fidelity, the budget was £3.50 per square meter for seed. They're very well suited to situations where minimizing risk of failure is important politically. So, using the sand and all that sort of stuff. I mean, if you really want to guarantee it, you've got to use sand in irrigation. If you're doing a motorway, it doesn't matter. You just do the bag and throw the bag on, because you only ever seed 100 kilometers per hour, and no one cares, because the landscape architects who commissioned the project, they don't know what the seedlings look like. No one knows what the seedlings look like except me. So there's no feedback loops. So this is why we're so bad at this in the public landscape, because it's the blind leading the blind leading the blind. Seriously? This is why we're really just not very good at this. So, but if you want to do it in a situation where you will be sued, then this sand and watering is actually a very good idea. Where no one cares, you can use less resource-intensive techniques, and you can just fail magnificently. Because everyone say, oh, God, it's a capricious thing, isn't it? Sowing seed, I must have offended God some way, on that day type thing. You think I'm joking? I'm absolutely serious about these things. In the longer term, it's management that determines what development. It's all the things that we saw before in Hokkaido, making those decisions, what you do, what you don't do. And one of the problems is hyper-flowery communities, the sort of stuff I've shown you, they're not as resilient to weed invasion as communities with a lot of grass in them. But if you have a lot of grass in them, you don't have many flowers. So again, it's one of these Faustian twists. You know, you have one or you have the other. If you have either, there are disadvantages. But you just have to live with that. There's no other way around it. And that's me. Coffee. Good.